Welcome back, Stealthwake fans. If you remember, in October, November of 2020, we upgraded the Stealthwake stock solid drive shaft to the flex shaft and strut system. At the time of making that video, I had discussed about having the stuffing tube go into the strut and how that effectively eliminates any adjustability for the prop angle. Now, before I get into the details, I do want to point out one other thing we've done to the Stealthwake between the end of 2020 and spring of 2021. So we always had the one water outlet. The rudder pickup went to the ESC, the existing hull pickup went to the motor, and then they came together in a coupler and came out just the one exit. So what we did is we added a second water outlet, so now both the motor and the ESC have separate water pickups and separate water outlets. Similar to what I did with the Invincible Razor, the ESC is closer to the stern, so the back water outlet is the ESC. The motor's closer to the bow, so the water outlet closer to the bow is the motor exit, so we can keep an eye on water flow. Getting back to our strut assembly. If you watch the video of our very first run with the strut assembly and the flex shaft in November, the very first run, the boat was kind of hopping all over the place and was really bow high, and we had some issues controlling it. We blamed it on the wind. We lowered the trim tabs, basically screwed these down tighter to get the trim tabs into the water, to push the bow down. The problem is it slowed the boat down, and you can see it noticeably in the video. So we ran again, first time in 2021. Again, it was a little bit windy, nothing terrible. And in that video, you can see, again, the boat is hopping around, it's porpoising. Wasn't uncontrollable, but definitely was not running as expected. The trim tabs are set neutral to the bottom of the hull, parallel. Now, we could have driven the screws in, the bolts in, and pushed the trim tabs down, but again, it would just slow the boat down. The decision was made to make the strut adjustable. Now, there's a couple different ways to do that. One option is to put a wet well in, which you'd have the larger diameter tube inside, and then you have your stuffing tube inside that, and that gives you some adjustability up and down. But as I pointed out in the build video, there isn't room in here, or at least I didn't feel there was enough room to put a wet well in. What I have done is I cut this end off. And this is a closer look at the stuffing tube that I cut off. So I actually ended up cutting the stuffing tube, I don't know, probably within a 1/16 of an inch to the transom, and then took a file and filed it down flush, mostly flush. It sticks out a little bit, but essentially it's flush. I didn't want to damage the paint any more than I already had, because you can see over here where I nicked the edge a little bit with the file. But the only thing sticking out the back here is a little piece of Teflon tubing. I put a new piece of Teflon tubing in and cut it to length so that the Teflon will extend into the strut. It's roughly 3/8 of an inch. Now, in order to make this work the way it needs to, the prop shaft still has to be supported into the strut. So I've cut another piece of brass tubing, and this piece of brass tubing will fit inside the strut, essentially flush with the transom side of the strut. Now, in order to keep the piece of brass tubing in there, and this is the stuffing tube brass tubing, in order to keep that in there, I didn't want to glue it. I've seen other people do this. I put a little bit of solder on two sides of the tubing. That way, when I push the stuffing tube into the strut, right about there, it gets tight. I just press that in, give it a little push. It takes a little more than just a fingertip, but I'll push that in probably with a block of wood so that I don't damage it. And here's a close-up of the stuffing tube pressed into the strut. You can just make out the lip of the brass tubing here. It's a little below flush from the surface of the strut. So that's pressed in. Took a little bit of effort, but again, I can get it out if we ever need to. And from this side, you can almost make out where that lip is. So again, there's some room there. That allows that floating bushing to float in and out as it's needed. But again, most of the bushing is contained by that 1/4 inch brass stuffing tube. That's and up to about this point. And that's basically where it was when we had the solid stuffing tube coming all the way into the strut. The brass tubing slides over the Teflon liner, and we put the bolt in to hold that in place. You can see there's a little bit of a gap here. What that allows, now that the Teflon liner going into the brass stuffing tube and stopping basically about here, that now allows us to adjust the angle of our prop shaft. The way I had to do this to get that gap is I took a piece of styrene sheet and bolted it in place between the transom and the strut bracket. That allowed me to get that space in there, because otherwise, when this is mounted tight to the transom, this is flush to the transom, and then you can lose the ability to get your negative prop angle. The Teflon liner actually helps keep water out of your stuffing tube and going up into the boat. And of course, it helps protect your prop shaft. The floating bushing still needs to go into the strut, so that'll push into there. This is supposed to be inside and have room to float in and out, as we discussed in the previous video. But right now, this is actually hitting the Teflon liner, which is, again, stopped about here. So if you were to take this out, put this up against here, you can see that this is now too long. So I'm going to end up having to cut this probably back, I don't know, maybe not quite to this hole, maybe to this hole, just so that the floating bushing can still do what it's supposed to do. Now, that brass stuffing tube inside, again, goes from this point up to about here. So again, that floating bushing could, in theory, go all the way back to basically to that point, but that's how it's supposed to work. Once I get that bushing trimmed, everything will go back together. Everything still lines up like it's supposed to. And then we'll be ready to go back to the pond. So here's a little better view of the adjustability. Obviously, if we went to a positive angle, the bow would be way high, and I don't know if we'd ever want to run like that, but you can go that way, and we can also go a little bit negative. You know, it's not the negative 6 degrees that the original boat was, thankfully, but we can get a couple of degrees of negative or down angle on that prop. So can't wait to try this out. We'll let you guys know how it works.